Hi, I'm Michael Goodson. I am the curator at the Contemporary Dayton, Dayton, Ohio's Contemporary Art Museum. And we have just opened our new galleries at Dayton's historic arcade, which is a building that has great historic importance to the city of Dayton, Ohio, and has been completely refurbished, including our lovely galleries there, which have just opened our inaugural exhibitions: Zachary Armstrong, Grids and Abstracts, Curtis Barnes, Love and Peace, and the artist we'll be speaking with tonight, Cauleen Smith, with Remote Viewing. Cauleen Smith is certainly the artist of our moment, but her work actually goes back a long way. I would cite the fact that from 2008 to 2012, she was an associate professor of art at the University of California, San Diego. In 2012, she was faculty at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, of which she is also a 2007 alum. In 2011, she also had an exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem in the video studio. In 2015, she was featured in LA's Film Forum at MoCA LA. And in 2019, she had a solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And most recently, in 2020, she is the recipient of the Studio Museum in Harlem's prestigious Joyce Alexander Wine Artist Prize. So with that, let me please introduce to you Cauleen Smith.
Hi.
Cauleen.
Thanks, Michael.
Certainly. I wanted to start tonight by talking a little bit about your bio, your personal history. Where were you born? Where were you raised? And where is the beginning of your connection to being an artist?
Well, I live in LA now, and I was born in Riverside, California, which isn't far from here. But I grew up in Sacramento until I was 17, and entirely public school educated by this great state of California, which no longer has that system, the public school system that I enjoyed. Maybe, going to a school with all kinds of kids, and all of us had access to things like a free musical instrument if we wanted to play one, and maybe wood shop or art classes or theater classes, whatever extracurricular things were considered kind of part of the core education. And I look back on that and I think I don't quite understand how kids even get through school without that stuff, and yet they're expected to. So that's the background. I mean, how did I think it's a complete accident that I am like a practicing artist. I feel like I completely stumbled into this, and I've always been drawn to creative activities, and I've always thought of creative activities as part of a certain kind of sociality, where certain enactments of people being like more authentically themselves are possible, and in ways that isn't possible in other kinds of contexts or disciplines. So I was always attracted to it. So I guess that's how I fell into it. But I think, I accidentally went to film school as an undergrad. I literally met some guys crossing the quad at San Francisco State, and they're like, "Hey, we're going to apply to the film school." And I was like, "Cool, I'm gonna come too." It was like so random. These guys are still my friends to this day. But I wish I had a more concise epiphany moment of becoming an artist. But it's just been one long accident after another.
I think that'll do. I wanted to talk with you. I kind of segue, perhaps maybe a little clumsily, right into the piece that we're showing, which is an older piece, and one that had really specific beginnings in terms of ideation, and then also initially a very specific context in which it was shown at the Kitchen in New York. But I wanted to start with where the inspiration for the work came from, which essentially, as I understand it, was a journey west, back west for you. And in doing so, thinking about the vastness of the West, and which I assume led to thoughts about land art and all of its glories and pathologies.
Yeah, you know,
Mostly
it's funny.
pathologies.
I am moving from Boston to San Diego, back to California after not living here for a long time. And also changing jobs from teaching within a film school to teaching inside of an art school. And these are really different conversations. And at that moment in the mid aughts, land art was having this historical resurgence. And it was every studio visit, every student I talked to, so many art historians and academics were really focusing on recuperating these histories and amplifying them. And like a really wonderful book by Smithson was released by a friend of mine from Austin. And I was really interested in this and started paying attention. And I felt like I had to pay attention because so many of my students were interested. But as I, dug into it and looked at the work and not really having the opportunity to visit these sites out in the middle of the desert, I was a little bit confused about what was happening. This is all, early 70s. And there, like a lot of these monumental gestures are kind of like enacted upon the earth in this way that seemed to not really consider the land itself and its histories. And that wasn't part of the conversation in land art history. And it just got me thinking, and then fast forward to being in San Diego and having my alarm clock wake me up with StoryCorps on NPR. And as I'm sort of half asleep, half awake, hearing the voice of Reverend Seawood talk about this memory of his experience at the age of 10. And I literally I had a physiological response in my sleep where I woke myself up with this sort of like moaning of shock, because I think I was dreaming what he was describing. And it was just kind of like this incomprehensible idea that you could bury a house. But then of course I'd been spending all this time looking at Smithson's partially buried shed and other enactments like that. And somehow they collided. And that's how this happened.
Who, for whatever reason, might not be familiar, James Turrell, Smithson Spiral Jetty, and then really the thing that I do see as the connecting component, which is partially buried woodshed, which is actually in Ohio. It's at it's in Akron, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And I know for a number of years its whereabouts was a little mysterious, having been buried after all. And but I do know that thinking about this, what you might talk to your students about at the end of this journey back west had to do with the more tyrannical elements of land art and this idea of the conflation of ownership, of property and of history.
Yeah, like these staking these claims on the earth. And, there's these stories that are affectionately told of like John Baldessari going out in the desert and like lighting off sticks of dynamite. And I'm just like, this isn't, whose land are you on? And, and often this was, national park. So it's supposed to be everyone's land. So this really interesting kind of, the staking of claims, and which comes out of America's long history with this land, that seemed to be considered irrelevant to the way we're supposed to look at these works as a purely aesthetic modernist objects. It's still a question for me, because I've never seen the Spiral Jetty, but I love the film that Robert Smithson made about it. It's like a wonderful film, and it was like a huge source of inspiration. And I guess my discontent comes at the sort of myopia of the scope of the conversation around these works more than the works themselves. Some of them seem a little bit more frightening and terrible, like the trenches and whatnot, than others. But I think I just wanted to expand the conversation into an actual confrontation to the land itself and our American histories on this land, you know?
Yeah, I think Smithson may have muscled this idea of ownership of land and history is a little less than Terrell and Heiser, but there were also lots of women involved in the land art movement, and some of those works are really beautiful and timeless, including Nancy Holt, Smithson's widow. But the catalytic moment here, well, first of all, I'd like to know, how did your students react to what seems to me was probably a critique of land art? What was their reaction to it, especially in that time where it was experiencing this resurgence?
Right. I would say not so well received. I mean, it's not like I'm pushing that point. My job as a visitor in the studio was to offer questions. So I would just sort of leave the questions there, and they would often just sort of like fall to the floor in a splat and not be picked up by the artist whose studio I'm in. And that was fine for me, because at that time I was asking these questions, sort of hoping that, these artists had some answers for me about how to think about it. And it wasn't until I guess I got a little bit frustrated with the not just the absence of that consideration, but I sense that there need not be a response to those questions. Like, why should we have to think about that? That's like a slightly infuriating response to what I think of as kind of like urgent questions dealing with like American sociality, So when I heard this story from Reverend Seawood, it really haunted me. Before I realized that I could maybe make something with it, it just kept playing over and over again in my head. I went online and I listened to it repeatedly, because I could not understand how you bury a house underground. Little did I know at that time, and I've since learned from later students, that it is a Midwestern practice to bury houses. Like, it's a thing that's done. On your land, if you have a decrepit house, it might be cheaper, easier, faster to just dig a hole and put the house in the hole than to reclaim the materials, reuse the materials, or dispose of them. I didn't know that, and I was still shocked to see it. Like just in a video made by one of my students, Ross Constable, a couple of years ago. But Smithson's Partially Buried Shed was my first sort of clue about like other ways of thinking about this. And I think this piece is particularly interesting because I'm a little bit dissatisfied with how it's discussed in art history, and grateful to other artists like Renee Green, who have also kind of like looked at this work and thought around it, for some help there.
But clearly the catalytic moment in terms of the making of remote viewing was the StoryCorps program that it sounds like you sort of took in via osmosis in half sleep.
Yeah.
We actually have, well, there's two things. First of all, I found a picture, I searched for a picture of this school before it was buried, and really could not find one, but found a picture of this school whose history was not so offensive, apparently, because it's still there. It's some sort of national landmark, and it is in Arkansas. Its proximity to Sheridan, Arkansas, I don't know. But it was interesting to me that, not every town buries its old schoolhouses. So, and then we have a clip of actually Reverend Seawood very briefly talking about his witnessing of this event. And maybe we can play that, and it will put, I think, so much into context.
Gradually, as the black population in town began to go down, that left my mother there at the school as the principal, the janitor, Whatever was needed, she had to do everything. And as long as there was one black child left in town, they had to keep the school open. So 10, 9, 8, mother was there till the last child, the last family was forced out of town. So I remember one day, mother and I got in the old station wagon because mother had heard that the school was going to be torn down. We went inside the school, we got whatever records we could find, we put them in the back of the station wagon. Then a big bulldozer came and dug a deep hole. And after digging this deep hole, just pushed our beloved school in the hole and covered it up. And it was as though it was never there. Years later, when I was in graduate school and people would talk about urban renewal and all of those kinds of ideas in my classes, I had a particular perspective. To me, urban renewal meant that they'll dig a deep hole and push your school, cover it up, and it'll be like the school never existed or you never existed. I'll never forget those days. Even today, this town of Sheridan, Arkansas is an all-white town. And if you ever have an opportunity to go through that town, drive very slowly.
That again is the Reverend James Seawood, whose story in part, again, sort of set you off on your journey to make this film,
Right.
Along with an amalgam of other experiences.
Sure. One of this film is really kind of critical in terms of a lot of my thinking even today. And I wanted to say the thing that's not in the recording, because it couldn't be, it's a long story, but is that this enactment of burying the schoolhouse came at the end of a very long and protracted process by which the white citizens of the town pushed all of the black mill workers and their families in the town out of the town. Because the desegregation laws had passed. They didn't want to integrate their schools, so the solution was to force removal of all the black citizens. And the thing that I wanted to say that because that actually wasn't unusual. That was actually why you have all white towns in America, is because of a kind of forced removal of black citizens who actually participated in the initial economies of those towns and workers. But then once they were no longer needed, and actually that's not true, even if they were needed, the more urgent concern was that the schools could not be integrated. And the only way to obey the federal law would be to eradicate all presence of blacks in the town. And so this Sheridan, Arkansas is by no means unique. It's actually more common than not that all the huge migrations of black people moving into cities had so much to do with this white resistance to integration of schools.
I know that this was all happening at a really pivotal moment too, as we were leading up to, among other things, the various protests and boycotts that ultimately culminated in the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Yes.
So these communities, while they were being emptied of the people that weren't wanted there were other communities that were fighting for their right to vote. Specifically, there was a 1964 lawsuit that actually made it to the Supreme Court called Gomillion versus Lightfoot. It came at the tail end of a 5-year boycott of the black citizens of Tuskegee, Alabama, of white-owned businesses. And it was primarily because they just wanted the right to not be gerrymandered out of their district. So it's really interesting to me that these two things that sort of operate on the opposite end of the spectrum were happening during this time. But clearly this is an attempt to erase a specific history, a community's history, but also histories that are specific to people, certainly specific to Reverend Seawood. And I'm curious, actually, as to how this entered your mind visually. So, how did the beginning of the production, based on your experience, start?
Well, my first thought was I was circling around this idea of trauma, and like the many iterations of that within the American psyche, culture, and history, and land itself. And then the second thing that I really had to think about was this idea about reenactments, and what does it mean to reenact something? And that actually links right up with trauma, because if you think about it, we don't really reenact our like best year 6 birthday party, or the best dance you ever had at the prom. Like, you don't reenact the highlights of one's childhood or life. We reenact and reinscribe on people all around us over and over again the traumas that we've suffered. And I didn't really understand how profound and serious and true that was until we were actually in the process of making the film, and until we actually filmed the house going into the ground. But I had to make some decisions about what it would mean to take this man's story. It's a story that he's telling as a memory of a 10-year-old child on top of that. And to use it as a material to think through all these like broader histories of the American land and its traumas, on both the land and the people, and those costs. So that's where I know you're going to ask me about the green screen, but this is where it came in, was this idea that I decided that I didn't want there to be any confusion. I didn't want to do a reenactment that like seduced us into thinking that what we were seeing was real or true. I wanted the reenactment to function kind of like as a document of a kind of procedures for erasure that I wanted us to like look at. And so the green screen became like this sort of like this way of suggesting that there's an elsewhere. I even considered, putting something onto the green screen, some part of Sheridan, but it seemed completely, once we erected that 30-foot tall by 30-foot wide scaffolding with the green screen fabric, it seemed to be doing its own. It's probably my first large scale sculpture I've ever made. Honestly, it was like a stunning object. I felt as if it was doing a lot just by being there as like a backdrop, an incomplete backdrop, still revealing like exactly where we were and exactly what was happening,
Yeah, it does disassociate the school from any given context. And I really like that about it, actually. I'm curious, though, about the construction of the school itself. How did that come about, and how difficult was that, and what was the research like for that?
Yeah, I mean, it was extensive. Like you said, like I couldn't find any images of the Sheridan, Arkansas schoolhouse. But there's no shortage of images of one-room schoolhouses in the American South. So I was able to show a lot of those to my art director. And then he also did his own research and got really into, what constitutes a schoolhouse. And they often had more than one function. They also could be sites of worship, maybe not a church, but a gathering place. So he did a lot of research about like the most humble version of this structure could be, and then he had to build it, which was, we're building a little house. We had to actually build a little house.
Yeah, and it's a really lovely structure, actually. And really important to that structure is the bell, because of the culmination of the film as it's being pushed into its grave, which is just the word that comes to mind for me whenever I look at it. the bell starts to ring pretty furiously and loudly, and almost protesting its own burial. Almost that history protesting its own burial. And then that incredible kaboom as it hits the bottom of the grave and quite literally disappears from sight. It's kind of, I really love the way it's shot. It reminds me actually of Meek's Crossing in terms of where the lens falls in terms of the perspective. It is definitely based on land level. And so when the school falls in, it literally disappears, which is incredibly effective. The dust, the noise settles, the dust settles, and then the machines come back in my estimation, quite blithely fill the hole in.
Gracefully, even.
Yeah. But there are characters, two characters in the film. They're kind of, and to me, they represent a mother and child, and probably Reverend Seawood and his mother, what is my thought. And I'm curious what those two characters, who are basically seem to bear witness to all of this, meant to you, and how you integrated them into the narrative of the film.
Yeah, I mean, the process of developing what this film would be it went over quite some time, like many months, a couple of years, and because it was funded by Creative Capital in like 2010, or I received money from Creative Capital in 2020 to make a film, possibly a feature, but I moved it into this project because they're like digging a very big hole and building a little house are really expensive things to do. So I spent all of the money on that. And that is aside to say that in that process of thinking about what kind of film it was going to be, I wrote a script with a mother and a son. It was told from the son's 10-year-old perspective. And for me, there's like this blind spot in his story, which is like, he just says, mother got word that the school was going to be torn down. And in that sentence, to me, is like an entire story. Mother got word that the school is going to be torn down. And I was like, I was imagining the machinations, what allies she might have had on the white side of town, who would have warned her, enabled her to get there in time to save documents and whatnot. But there were some things that I didn't know or understand until we shot it. One is that it's really, until it was time to find the land to shoot, it's almost impossible, at least in Southern California, to find some land where you can dig a 20-foot deep hole, because there's electrical wires, there's gas, and once I let go of the idea of reenactment in a literal way, the characters became more, like you said, these symbolic witnesses. And in this picture, you can see how it's so wonderful that they're there, so you can comprehend the scale that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And that's the scale required to bury a structure underground. And the only way that I got access to this land was because of the economic crash of 2007. I just arrived at UC San Diego in 2008. The art school was supposed to build this brand new building, but it was stalled. So the land had already been surveyed and prepared for construction. The contractor was there on site every day. The land was fenced off, and he even had the excavators there, and he couldn't do anything because the money was frozen. And after looking all over Southern California, the desert, the mountains, the suburbs, like subdivisions, you name it, for a place I could dig a hole, someone in my department was like, why don't you go ask that guy? And I talked to him. He's like, actually, I said, what would it take for us to get the university to let me like dig a hole on this land? He's like, actually, you don't have to ask anybody but me, because there's some kind of legal transition that happens when the contractor takes on a project. The land becomes their responsibility. The insurance is his. He's like, I've got these guys, they're waiting to work. And if you pay them their rate, we'll dig this hole for you. No problem. So that's like how it happened.
Well, I'd love actually to look at just a couple clips of the characters, and then really kind of the apex, if you will, of the film as the history is being pushed into its grave. But before we did that, I wanted to talk to you about the original context in which this film was shown, which I know only through images, sadly. Which it was an incredible show that was at the Kitchen in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what? Because we had talked initially about perhaps screening the entire thing, and your reservation was it's really not its purpose. Its purpose in its original context was to lead your eye to these other incredible things that were happening in that dark space at the Kitchen in New York. And if you could talk to us a little bit about its original showing and that original context.
Yeah, there's one equally long companion film that was screened right next to remote viewing that I called The Grid, which was also another enactment of a Smithson work, in which all I saw of it was a photograph and a sketch that he made. And it was just that he put a grid, a perfectly rigid grid, around a tree on the Kent State campus while he was there on a residency. And the grid is just such a problem in modernism for a lot of reasons that we don't have to get into. But again, this this aesthetics, the aesthetics around staking claim and ordering and claiming land, I thought was so interesting. And so we made a film where my good friend and a great actor, Alim Brahan Sapp, and I tried to remake Smithson's grid around this gorgeous old oak tree in Malibu State Park. And what I learned, and this is another thing about the ecology of these artworks, these land artworks, is that, you know, the state park, park rangers, they didn't want me to do it because it would compact the land, and they're trying to recuperate this land. It's been compacted, which means it's difficult for things to grow, things like trees to grow, because this land was once Fox movie lot, and this is where they shot MASH. And this oak tree that I was obsessed with is like a movie star. He's like, oh, the reason you love this tree is because you've seen it in a dozen movies. And I thought, oh, this is so perfect. What do I have to do? He said, you can only use tomato stakes, like these little tiny wires, and that'll be good for the land. And if you use those stakes, then you can stick them in the ground and you can make your grid. But otherwise, no way, you know. So we did that, and that meant that the work could only fail. So there's this film next to remote viewing where we're running this pink construction tape to make this grid in the windy, like, valley of Malibu, and it just can't happen. It's just failing. It's just an imperfect grid. And then there's also another wall of a series of, I believe, 4 monitors that become smaller and smaller as they sort of ascend up the wall. And they were looking at land in Central Africa, in Darfur to be precise, which was kind of like atrocities were going on at that time. It was impossible to ignore. And in my mind, somehow I conflated all of these sort of like traumatic instances of land, and also this idea of the tree and shelter and structure and architecture, and how that is actually used in Central and West Africa as the site of schoolhouses. This is what you do school under the tree. So there was like this sort of conversation between the schoolhouse in one film, the grid and the tree in another film, and then these series of like kinds of like questions and much more abstract videos about the tree and learn like the tree as a school. And I thought that because the slow pace of the video, I thought of this as like not a film. I thought of it as like a kind of time loop in which someone might walk into the room and just see only the green screen. They might come after the house has been buried, and they'll only see that for like 3 minutes, you know, and they won't know what has occurred. But with the other films, there might be some question about like what has happened there. That was my idea.
I can tell you that what I have personally done when I'm in the galleries is to first of all, encourage people to pick up the gallery guide so they can kind of get an idea of the entire 15 minutes or so of the film. And then if they have sat through a part that is a little fallow, that they don't understand, I explain the entire story to them, and they inevitably go back into the gallery and walk out kind of mesmerized. And then that sets them up actually for the books, which we'll talk about in just a moment here. But what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is just play these couple clips from the film just to give you an idea of what I'm talking people into going back to look for, which I've done very diligently, I'll say.
Thank you for that.
If we could, you're welcome. If we could cue the mother and child footage really briefly, and then the burial, that would be great. That's the perfect example of what I was talking about when I was mentioning Kelly Reichert's film Meek's Crossing, because so much of that film has the camera at ground level, and you really do get a sense of the arduous journey because you're right at the level at which they're moving. And in this case, you're right at the level at which this history suddenly absolutely disappears, and it's an incredibly moving thing for me. But the film does tie into a book, which is the book for remote viewing is something of a storyboard and so much more. We had chosen, I know the books before have been shown in various ways. We had the great luck of when we accordioned out the books. I think remote viewing accordions out to about 14 feet, give or take, and invisible knapsack almost twice that, or approaching twice that. And my immediate reaction was, because we had not yet had access to the building, was to run across town and start measuring the walls to see if we could make these bespoke shelves so that we could quite literally accordion the books out completely, thus tying in the filmic quality of the books to the film itself. And I'm curious about how the books for you play into the film, or for that matter, how the film plays into the books at a given point.
Yeah, I really struggled with how to pay homage to Reverend Seawood. That was one thought, and I'd done so much writing and thinking around land art, and then research about this idea of reenactment. That's like where the title remote viewing comes from. You know, this idea of gaining deeper insight into something by redoing it and looking back in that way. I for myself, I wanted to put all of that in one place. It was like a pretty intensive research and writing project for me. And then some people saw it and were like, oh, this would just be a beautiful book. And then I asked my friend Tisa Bryant, who's a wonderful writer, to write an essay for me. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to make my own little artist book. And I don't know. I wanted another way to disseminate and actually deepen the text. And then, you know, making books and there was so much waste. And while I was working on this project, actually, it was a little bit controversial, apparently, filming on UCSD campus. There were like some people who sort of took offense to the fact that I found this amazing workaround so that it didn't require sort of like the blessing of any dean or provost or anybody to shoot the film. This became a problem. I started to have a lot of political problems at UC San Diego. I was having some really disturbing encounters with some of my colleagues. And the thing that really surprised me was how little was understood about racial privilege. This was in 2010. I think now maybe people have like gotten a hold of some reading lists and have studied up a little bit. But in 2010, if you suggested that as a Black professor on campus, you were treated differently, not just by the staff and faculty, but also by students, that was a controversial statement, one that I made, and then I was accused of being a racist myself, et cetera, snowballing. And there was really no way to overcome the fragility and brittleness and sort of like self-superiority of my colleagues at that time. And I thought, well, maybe I can reach them with a document that really taught me a lot about privilege, which was this amazing list made in the early 80s by Peggy McIntosh called The Knapsack of White Privilege. And it's just a list of things that white people can do and count on that you can't count on if you're not white in American everyday life. Mundane things like from the color of a Band-Aid to, not being followed around when you're buying toothpaste at the CVS, and then as I was looking for that list, I found all of these other amazing lists that people had made, riffing off of her list, a list about what it means to be a gay man, a list about what it means to be a woman, a list about it was like incredible. I assembled all of the lists. And that's why this book is so long, is because I didn't edit any of the lists I found online. I just put them all together. And my plan was to give it to my colleagues, but then someone talked me out of that. And I'm glad I didn't.
Well, the great good fortune of having stumbled across this idea of opening them up this way for the first time is that people are actually reading them. So I'll walk by the gallery, and 5 minutes later I'll walk by and they'll be 8 feet down, taking it all in. Spending a lot of time in that room. So we're incredibly happy about that. And it was really just a dumb luck that the room fit the books. So
I feel really fortunate.
We're really, and then the other show that is going on during the show is a painter who is from Dayton, but who taught generations of painters. A guy named Curtis Barnes Sr., who taught at Central State University and is an incredible painter. And we hung a series of self-studies in very close proximity as this kind of filmic idea that sort of becomes the nexus of these two shows.
Nice.
Which works really beautifully, I think. And we're just very happy that we were able to show your work, and this work, which I've been in love with for such a long time. And we want to thank Corbett vs. Dempsey in Chicago and you for your time. I don't know if we have any questions. I can't tell. I'm not technically inclined. I don't see anything.
No questions.
No, well, in any case, I really appreciate your time. I think the work is beautiful. I think it stands alone, oddly beautiful. I would have loved to see it in that original context, but thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Michael. I'm just so delighted. It's just been wonderful to actually talk about this work. I've never done that before. And thanks for the questions and all the context. And thanks for everyone who checked in this evening. I really appreciate that. Thanks. It was fun talking to you. We're
honored. And we'll talk to you soon, I hope.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much.
As your partner is from Dayton, Ohio, I'm told. So
Right.
that's right. You eventually have
Hello,
to come to Dayton. Okay.
All right.
Thanks,
Good
Cauleen.
night.
Good
Bye.
night. Bye.